Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something super fascinating, the bleeding edge of local AI. We're running a bit of an experiment, pushing consumer hardware to its absolute breaking point for a completely unexpected task: user interface design. We really want to find out, can local AI models actually generate beautiful, usable designs, or do they just totally crumble under the pressure? Let's find out. Okay, let's dive into this. When we think about local large language models, the ones you run right on your own machine, we usually treat them as text-based tools, right? We use them to read and write. We ask them for research, brainstorming, maybe summarizing long documents, or doing some quick fact-checking. But the release of a new tool called Open Design, it's completely opened the door for something entirely different. It lets you hook up local models straight to a canvas to generate visual interfaces. So it really begs the question, can these number-crunching, text-heavy models actually pull off local UI vibe design? To answer that, we're framing this explainer as a three-way battle royale. Here's our agenda for today. 1. The vibe design experiment. 2. Qwen, the expected winner. 3. Mistral, the rough draft. 4. Gemma, the underdog champion. And finally, 5. Why coding equals good design. All right, Section 1, the vibe design experiment. Let's set the baseline and establish the parameters of the arena so you have a mental rubric to grade these AI models against. To make sure this is a fair fight, all 3 local models got the exact same design brief for a fictional bookstore and café. And the requirements? They were really specific. The AI had to generate event cards, clearly displaying dates and locations. It needed to build a café menu split into 2 distinct columns, complete with pricing. It had to include a working contact form with contact info. And maybe the most important part for this test, it needed to stylize the whole thing with warm paper tones and a really distinct handmade feel. So it wasn't just about functional code. It was about capturing a true vibe. Moving right along to Section 2, Qwen, the expected winner. Let's see how our favorite did. Now, going into this experiment, Qwen 3.5 9B was actually the heavy favorite. Why? Because the author of our source experiment had successfully run Qwen in Open Design for a past project. It was supposed to be the reliable one. But Qwen stumbled almost immediately out of the gate. Instead of rendering a nice, proper, interactive form, Open Design's discovery questionnaire just spilled out as raw JSON text directly into the chat window. The rendering pipeline literally just broke down. Now, that massive 40,000 number, that is exactly why the breakdown happened. It was a context length issue. See, since the last time the author used the tool, Open Design's system prompt had grown a lot. The old 30,000 token limit, it just wasn't cutting it anymore. So, to fix the JSON spill, the context length had to be pushed all the way up to 40,000 in LM Studio. And look, if you know your hardware, you know that pushing a 40,000 token context window on an 8GB VRAM GPU is enough to make your graphics card seriously sweat. It barely fit without spilling over, but thankfully the hardware held up. So, after turning off Open Design's prototype mode, which was actually just causing Qwen to endlessly narrate its plan instead of writing actual code, the generation finally went through. And functionally, Qwen did a stellar job. It hit every single functional requirement of the brief. We got the event cards, the 2-column menu, the working contact form, the whole shebang. But it completely missed the vibe. Instead of those warm paper tones and the handmade feel we asked for, it just defaulted to a totally sterile, bright white background. Functionally perfect, sure, but aesthetically, pretty lacking. All right, so Qwen survives, but completely misses the mark on aesthetics. Let's move on to Section 3, Mistral, the rough draft. With Mistral, the author and the Open Design tool honestly had to just part ways because of some intense technical friction. Mistral started off by throwing this very specific Jinja template error about user and assistant roles. The default Mistral I build had a patched prompt template that absolutely refused to cooperate. So this initial hurdle meant abandoning the default build entirely and swapping over to the LM Studio community build of Mistral 7B Instruct version 0.3, literally just to get the prompt to register. But here's the kicker. Even after fixing the template error, Open Design still wouldn't render the canvas. Mistral was just spitting out raw artifact tags as plain text instead of actually triggering the renderer. So we had to pivot to a manual workaround. Step 1, run the design prompt directly in LM Studio's standard chat interface. Step 2, copy and save that generated HTML into a local file. And Step 3, render that file through Visual Studio Code's live server extension to actually see what the model built. Obviously a super clunky manual pivot, but it did let us see Mistral's actual design work. So what did Mistral actually produce after all that manual rendering? Well, it was definitely a rough draft. It completely failed on the functional structures. Like, instead of neat event cards, it just spat out these basic bulleted lists. Instead of a 2-column café menu with pricing, it just lazily wrote a coming soon placeholder. The whole thing felt crammed and compressed, like it was just trying to do the absolute bare minimum. However, and we really have to give it some credit here, unlike Qwen, Mistral actually understood the vibe. It successfully applied a beautiful serif font and this really nice warm cream background. It totally nailed the mood, even if it completely botched the architecture. Okay, so we've got one model that got the structure but missed the vibe, and one that got the vibe but missed the structure. Which brings us to Section 4, Gemma, the underdog champion. This is the model that was almost entirely written off before it produced a single pixel. Gemma couldn't produce anything usable in open design at all. After a solid minute of churning, it just threw an error, basically saying the provider ended the request without returning anything. It just buckled. And honestly, it makes sense. Running a heavy 12 billion parameter model on just 8 gigabytes of VRAM is always going to be an absolute slog. It's probably a mix of the hardware struggling, LM Studio timing out, and open design just not perfectly parsing Gemma's outputs yet. Whatever the reason, it looked like a total failure on the surface. But since the author already had that manual live server workaround set up from the Mistral test, they decided, why not? Let's run Gemma's prompt through LM Studio directly and just see what happens. And this brilliantly illustrates the massive gap in quality when you actually get the render to work. Compared to Mistral's crammed bulleted lists and lazy placeholders, the HTML that Gemma generated was stunning. Once we manually rendered it, Gemma produced these incredibly intuitive layout hierarchies and confident typography with beautiful serif headlines. It built properly styled call-to-action buttons. It actually created detailed, real-feeling event cards with awesome stylistic touches, like writing October 12th as an overline. But I have to say, Gemma's absolute crowning achievement was the café menu. It didn't just meet the brief. It designed a genuinely great interface. It perfectly split the layout into 2 columns for drinks and food. It took the initiative to format the prices in italics and align them perfectly to the right side of the column, which is exactly what a professional designer would do. And it even got super creative with the content, making up items like an oat milk latte and a bookish brownie. It didn't just write code. It designed an experience that felt like a real-world, professionally crafted web page. Let's jump into our post-match analysis. Section 5, Why Coding Equals Good Design. So the crucial point here is summarized perfectly by this quote from our source material. An LLM doesn't have eyes, right? It doesn't inherently understand visual beauty the way a human painter or designer does. Its visual design sense, meaning its ability to understand layout, hierarchy, and typography, is really just a byproduct of its coding proficiency. Because Gemma was a stronger coding model, its HTML and CSS were vastly superior, and that inherently resulted in a vastly superior visual design. When the code generation is solid, well, the vibe design just kind of comes along for the ride. Now, yes, running these models locally means dealing with some real technical friction, manual render workarounds, and absolutely maxing out your GPU's memory. But Gemma just proved that consumer hardware is absolutely capable of generating real, usable design work right now. So, I want to leave you with this final thought. If a local model sitting right there on your desk can generate stunning typography, intuitive layout hierarchies, and creative aesthetic choices entirely offline, how will you integrate local vibe design into your own workflow? The tools are here, they're free, and they're literally only getting smarter. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I highly encourage you to go test these models on your own machine today.